Hello and welcome back to Good Nightmare. This is the official 50th episode of the podcast. If you've been here from the very beginning or you're just tuning in for the first time today, I just want to say thank you so much for joining in and going on this, not to be too cliche, but little journey with me. I think I've spoken about this before, but I mostly started the podcast because one, I like to talk, and two, I like to tell stories. And this is a way that I can tell stories to you guys. I've also always wanted to read audiobooks, mostly classics for something like LibriVox, so that I can share my love of reading with others and I guess put my own spin on things. And through this podcast, I kind of am able to do that, especially when I read fairy tales to you guys. Today's episode covers 3 of my favorite things. We have a spiritual phenomenon, a related case, which I don't want to spoil, but to give you a hint, my favorite things are unsolved mysteries, elaborate hoaxes, and conspiracies, and also a haunted film, or cursed film rather. I am not much of a movie buff, but I love movie trivia. And cursed film trivia is some of my favorite kind. Even though this is episode 50, I don't have anything special planned. I guess if you want to share the podcast with a friend or family member or on social media, that would be awesome. The larger audience we reach, the more people I get to tell stories to, and the more good people that I get to meet. So I was perusing cursed films when I realized I haven't really touched on this particular topic. I have done a case before that involved a poltergeist, but I haven't really focused in on it or done related cases or, like I said, looked at the cursed film by the same name. This episode covers what poltergeists are, a related case, and the cursed film. A poltergeist is a type of spirit that's often known for being incredibly disruptive. They're known for moving objects, including throwing them across the room, tipping them over, knocking things off walls, creating noise in the house, disturbances such as knocking, or even pinching, hitting, biting, or otherwise physically interfering with the people they attach themselves to. Poltergeist actually, in its original form, roughly translates to noisy spirit, which makes sense because they are incredibly loud and incredibly disruptive. Similar to spirit activities and experiences, there are records of poltergeist activity that date back as far as the 1st century. This is nothing new and definitely was not brought forward by pop culture. There was a concentration of reported cases that occurred in the early 1600s though. Poltergeist activity also isn't limited to a specific culture or region. Cases have been reported from Pakistan to Australia, from Japan to America, and across many countries in Europe. These spirits really get around. Unlike many spirits who tend to attach themselves to a particular place or object, poltergeists are thought to attach themselves to a particular person. And in this way, they're able to follow the person around, even if they should try to move away, for example, in an attempt to relieve themselves of the haunting. The poltergeist will follow. There are multiple theories that have attempted to explain poltergeist activity, including wishful thinking, delusions, allegedly affected children simply throwing or moving objects themselves when unobserved, hallucinations, and in a case in 1957 at Cape Cod, supposed poltergeist activity was able to be explained by Milbourne Christopher when he attributed a mirror falling from a wall and chairs tipping over, as well as objects being knocked off a bookshelf, to an unusual air current that blew with such force through a chimney, it disturbed the objects in the room. Personally, in looking at different cases throughout the years of hauntings, reincarnations, and poltergeists, it seems to be that poltergeist activity is the most commonly faked or most commonly thought to be fraud. I suppose that's because it's such a physical haunting. And though a lot of physical activity occurs, it's often only witnessed or reported by a particular person or household. In a sense, it's more easily faked. If poltergeists are to be believed real, and I personally never rule anything out, there's so much about the world that we just don't know or can't explain, and speculating is a lot more fun than not. Then they are often thought to be malicious spirits. Their intention is to disturb and wreak havoc against the people that they attach themselves to. This differs from other spirits which most often simply exist in a space, either because they can't move on or because they have such a strong attachment to it. In looking at cases of poltergeist activity, I wanted to go with one that's a little bit more modern. A reasonably recent case of poltergeist attachment was reported in 1984 and was dubbed the Columbus Poltergeist case. The case affected a woman named Tina Resch, who experienced levitating or flying objects as well as other activities. Fred Shannon, a photojournalist, published a series of photos that showed Resch sitting in an armchair while a phone allegedly flew past in front of her. Resch and her adoptive parents, whom she was living with, reported seeing poltergeist activity such as flying objects in their home after Resch had watched the film Poltergeist. This case was investigated, and parapsychologist William Roll came to stay in the Resch household to investigate the case firsthand. He claimed that there were legitimate events reported, however, never personally witnessed any movement of objects himself. In fact, in one case, where a picture had fallen from a wall, Resch had been in that area for 30 minutes prior, and Roll admitted he was facing away when the picture fell. This easily could have been a case of Resch tampering with the picture or pushing it off the wall when Roll wasn't looking. Another investigator, James Randi, who was skeptical of the case and believed it to be a hoax, was denied access to the home for investigative purposes. No surprise there. Resch was not commonly believed. Many people thought she was simply a disturbed young woman, or that she was faking the accounts for attention. Terence Hines, in his book Pseudoscience and the Paranormal, reported that the Resch poltergeist turned out to be so elusive that no one ever actually saw a single object even start to move of its own accord. This included the newspaper photographer, who found that if he watched an object, it stubbornly refused to budge, so he would hold up his camera and look away. One of the photos obtained in this way was distributed by the Associated Press and touted widely as proof of the reality of the phenomenon. Examined closely, the photographic evidence in this case strongly suggested that Tina was faking the occurrences by simply throwing the phone and other flying objects where no one was looking. Randy's careful analysis of the other photos, many unpublished, of Tina and her flying phone strengthened the conclusion that she was faking. The editor of the Columbus Dispatch, Luke Feck, embarrassed by the revelation that he and his paper were taken in by so obvious a fake, refused Randy permission to print the photos he had given him earlier in an apparent attempt to suppress the evidence of Tina's trickery and the newspaper's credulity. As Terence suggests, it would appear that investigators were right to be skeptical. A television crew accidentally left a camera running in the home during investigation, which caught Tina Resch knocking over a lamp and then screaming as though she was frightened, and pretending that it had been done by the poltergeist. When she was caught out and confronted with the film evidence, she claimed that she faked the event to get reporters to leave, which doesn't make much sense. You would assume that in seeing or witnessing activity, they would be more inclined to stay. Tina's story ends tragically. Her life didn't improve much after this case, and the next 30 seconds or so of this section mentions the death of a child, so please skip ahead if you need to. As always, details will be kept to a minimum so as not to be upsetting to the listener. Tina, later in life, changed her name to Christina Boyer after 2 marriages and 2 divorces. She had a young daughter named Amber, who was only 3 years old when she was found dead as a result of physical abuse. It was suspected that Christina's boyfriend, David Heron, was responsible, as Christina was not present at the time of her child's death. The pair turned on each other during inquiry, each blaming the other for the death of their child. Tina was ultimately charged and sentenced to life imprisonment plus 20 years after entering an Alford plea, which allowed her to maintain her innocence while still accepting her sentence. Her partner Heron, however, was convicted of cruelty to children and sentenced to only 20 years. He was released in 2011. During the trial, Boyer's poltergeist case was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in 1993. The poltergeist film, which appeared to have inspired Tina to fake her own poltergeist attachment, is also rumoured to be cursed. Watching the film is perfectly safe. However, cast and crew who have worked on any of the poltergeist films were affected after filming. In this episode, I chose to focus on the 3 children in the poltergeist film. This does mention 2 deaths, including domestic violence, so please listen with care or feel free to skip over the next few minutes or seconds as you need to. Dominique Dunn, who played Dana, the eldest daughter in the first installment of Poltergeist, was murdered by her ex-boyfriend on November 4, 1982, only 22 years old. To add to the tragedy, John Sweeney was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, sentenced to 6 years, but only served 3.5. Heather O'Rourke played Carol Ann in all 3 films. She passed away at only 12 years old due to complications from an acute bowel obstruction. And finally, Oliver Robbins was attacked by a mechanical clown during filming. In his scene, he was supposed to be struggling with a clown doll that the poltergeist was working through. But during the filming of the scene, the clown's mechanics malfunctioned and Oliver was actually being strangled. Due to the nature of the scene, the crew didn't pick up on this being a real situation until Oliver started turning blue. He's currently working, or was last said to be currently working, on a documentary that covers the untimely deaths and other possibly related curses to the poltergeist films. During the filming and after the filming, plenty of crew members were also affected by tragedy or near-death experiences, and that is why it's thought to be cursed. If you're interested in hearing about more cursed films, I would suggest you listen to my episode on The Exorcist. That is another wild story. As always, thank you so much for listening and for sharing my podcast with friends, family, social media, whoever, and encouraging others to listen. You have no idea how much it means to me to be able to create this little community that we have, and I really appreciate it. For case recommendations or just to chat, you can reach me on social media at goodnightmare_s on Instagram or Twitter, or you can email me at goodnightmare_s@outlook.com. Until next time, sweet dreams.
It is written, The meek shall inherit the earth, but not on my watch. I am King Asilas. I wasn't born to be a king, but America needed something democracy could no longer give her. And so, like a chess master, I made my moves with anticipation and bravado. This is not just my story, nor simply about my rise to power. This is a story about our world and the monsters that control governments. What happens when the monsters cannot control me? The Rise of King Asilas. Listen on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher. Visit theriseofkingasilas.com.